My daughter-in-law walked into my office with a confident smile, already planning how she'd spend my $53 million fortune after I died. She had no idea that before the week was over, every dream she'd built around my money would disappear, and she'd walk away with absolutely nothing. Before we dive into it, tell me in the comments where you're from. I love seeing the different places people tune in from. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. Now, please stick with me, because what happened next completely changed one family's future. My name is Maren Hale, and at 59, I had spent decades quietly building a successful investment business worth $53 million. I never lived like a millionaire, choosing a simple life over flashy displays of wealth. After my husband passed away years ago, my only focus became raising my son, Nash, into a kind and responsible man. When he married Brielle Cross, I truly believed our family was growing. She was polite, charming, and seemed grateful to be part of our lives. For a short time, everything felt peaceful. Then little things started catching my attention. Brielle casually asked questions about my will, my investments, my trusts, and what would happen to everything if I were gone. At first, I brushed it off as curiosity, but the questions became more frequent and more specific. The warmth she showed me slowly felt less genuine. It became painfully clear that she wasn't focused on building a relationship with me. She was quietly trying to calculate what she believed would one day belong to her. I kept telling myself not to judge Brielle too quickly. Every family has an adjustment period after a wedding, and I wanted to believe she simply needed time to feel comfortable. Whenever something bothered me, I reminded myself that patience was part of being a good mother-in-law. But as the weeks passed, the woman who had once seemed thoughtful and respectful slowly disappeared. Brielle began criticizing the way I lived, saying my home looked outdated and my furniture belonged in another decade. She laughed at my old sedan and asked why someone with my wealth would drive something so ordinary. I told her I had never believed happiness came from expensive things, but she only smiled as if she pitied me. Soon, she started talking about remodeling the family estate, calling it an investment for our future. The way she said those words made me uneasy because she spoke as though the house already belonged to her. Nash didn't notice anything unusual. Whenever I gently mentioned my concerns, he defended his wife, insisting she was only excited about building a future together and wanted everyone to enjoy it. I wanted to believe him, but Brielle's conversations with me always found their way back to the same subject. She casually asked when I planned to retire, whether I had updated my will recently, and if my trusts had beneficiaries listed. She brought up inheritance so often that it no longer felt like curiosity. I finally understood that she wasn't trying to know me as family. Every discussion was centered on one thing, my money, and when she thought it would become hers. As the holidays approached, I hoped spending more time together would bring our family closer. Instead, every gathering became another opportunity for Brielle to shape how people saw us. The moment relatives or friends arrived, she transformed into the perfect daughter-in-law. She helped in the kitchen, complimented everyone, and spoke to me with so much kindness that anyone watching would think we had the perfect relationship. But the second we were alone, her attitude changed completely. She criticized my decisions, rolled her eyes at my opinions, and made small comments that chipped away at my confidence. One afternoon she looked around my dining room and casually said I had done well for my generation, but managing a fortune at my age must be exhausting. She added that Nash would probably do a better job handling the investments before I made a costly mistake. I calmly told her I was still perfectly capable of running the business I had built from the ground up. She simply smiled and changed the subject before anyone else could hear. Over time, she repeated these subtle remarks often enough that some relatives began agreeing with her. They started asking whether I had considered retiring and letting Nash take over. When I explained I wasn't ready, I noticed disappointed looks, as though I was standing in the way of my son's future. Nash believed everyone was simply trying to help. He couldn't see that Brielle had carefully planted each idea long before anyone spoke it aloud. Watching my own family slowly question my judgment hurt more than I wanted to admit, but I refused to surrender something I had spent my entire life building. One quiet afternoon, I stopped by the family estate after meeting with a client. Nash and Brielle weren't home, and I planned to leave a few documents for my son before heading back to my office. As I placed the envelope on the desk in the study, a folder lying partially open caught my attention. I wasn't looking for anything, but my name printed across the top page made me pause. Thinking it might be something important, I opened it. Within seconds, my heart sank. The paperwork had been prepared by an attorney and outlined possible transfers of my major assets after my death. Nothing had been signed, and the documents carried no legal authority yet, but every page assumed my fortune would soon pass into different hands. My investments, real estate, and business interests were all listed with notes about future ownership. I read each page twice, hoping I had misunderstood, but the message was impossible to ignore. Brielle wasn't simply wondering about an inheritance anymore. She had already taken the first steps toward claiming it. What hurt most wasn't the money, it was seeing my life reduced to numbers on a page while I was still alive and perfectly capable of managing everything myself. For a moment, I considered calling Nash and demanding an explanation. Instead, I carefully returned every document exactly where I had found it. If I confronted them now, they would only deny everything or make excuses. I needed facts, not arguments. As soon as I left the house, I called my longtime attorney and asked for a confidential meeting. Without telling anyone in the family, I decided it was time to protect everything I had spent my life building before someone else tried to take it from me. A few days later, I met privately with the legal team that had protected my business for years. I brought them everything I had seen and asked them to review every financial record connected to my estate and the family. I wasn't looking for revenge or trying to accuse anyone without proof. I simply wanted to know whether my instincts had been right. My attorneys worked quietly, checking documents, account activity, and every request involving my investments. Within a week, they returned with information that left me deeply disappointed. Brielle had made several attempts to gather confidential details about my holdings without speaking to me directly. She had contacted distant family connections, asked personal questions about my investment portfolio, and tried to learn how my trusts were structured. She even hinted that she expected to help manage the family's financial future, hoping someone would reveal information they had no right to share. Fortunately, everyone with professional responsibilities refused to disclose anything private, so none of her efforts succeeded. Still, the pattern was impossible to ignore. These weren't random questions asked out of curiosity. They showed careful planning and a growing interest in assets that were never hers to control. My attorneys asked whether I wanted them to confront Brielle or notify Nash immediately. I shook my head. Starting a family argument without complete understanding would only create more division and give Brielle an opportunity to play the victim. I instructed everyone involved to remain completely silent and continue monitoring anything unusual. If Brielle believed no one suspected her intentions, she would eventually reveal far more than she ever meant to. Sometimes the strongest response isn't immediate confrontation. Sometimes the truth becomes far more powerful when people expose themselves without realizing anyone is watching. Over the next several weeks, Brielle's patience seemed to disappear. She no longer hinted about the future. Instead, she openly encouraged Nash to persuade me to step away from my business. One evening, he invited me to dinner and gently suggested that maybe it was time for me to retire. He said I had worked hard enough and deserved to enjoy life without the stress of managing investments every day. Under different circumstances, I might have appreciated his concern, but I recognized those words immediately. They weren't coming from my son. They sounded exactly like Brielle. She sat quietly beside him, nodding with a supportive smile, allowing him to believe the idea was entirely his own. Nash insisted that if I transferred financial authority now, everything would be easier for the family in the future. I calmly asked why there was suddenly such urgency when I was healthy, fully capable, and still actively running a successful business. Neither of them gave a convincing answer. Brielle quickly changed the subject, but the message had already been delivered. As the days passed, Nash brought up retirement more often. He never demanded anything, but he repeated the same arguments almost word for word. Each conversation left me with a heavier heart. I knew my son loved me, yet he couldn't see how carefully he was being influenced. Watching him unknowingly defend ideas that clearly benefited someone else hurt more than any discussion about money ever could. For the first time since all of this began, I realized the greatest risk wasn't losing my fortune. It was losing the trust and closeness I had spent my entire life building with my only child. My birthday arrived a few weeks later, and I decided to keep the celebration simple. Close relatives and a few longtime friends gathered at my home for dinner, and for a while, everything felt peaceful. People laughed, shared old memories, and wished me many more healthy years. I hoped we could enjoy one evening without tension, but Brielle seemed to have something else in mind. During dinner, the conversation turned to family traditions and the future. With a pleasant smile, she raised her glass and joked that it would soon be the next generation's turn to take over. A few guests laughed politely, thinking it was harmless, but I noticed Brielle carefully watching everyone's reactions. She wasn't making an innocent comment. She was testing whether others would support the idea of me stepping aside. Several relatives nodded in agreement, and I quietly realized how successful she had been at shaping their opinions over the past few months. Later that evening, after most of the guests had left, Brielle found me alone while I was clearing the dining table. In a calm voice, she told me that older people should know when to step aside while they still had the chance to enjoy life. She said it wasn't meant as an insult but as practical advice. I looked at her for a long moment, smiled politely, and thanked her for sharing her thoughts. I didn't argue or raise my voice because there was nothing left to discuss. In that quiet moment, I understood exactly who she was and what she wanted. As she walked away believing she had planted another seed of doubt, I had already made the decision that would determine how this entire story would end. The week after my birthday, I met with my attorneys one final time to make decisions I had hoped would never be necessary. I spent several hours reviewing every page of my estate plan, carefully considering how to protect everything I had worked so hard to build. My goal wasn't to punish Nash or take away his future. I still loved my son with all my heart, and I wanted him to be financially secure for the rest of his life. What I could no longer accept was the possibility that someone motivated by greed might gain control of my life's work simply by being married to him. Together, my legal team and I created a completely new estate plan. Nearly all of my assets were transferred into protected charitable and educational trusts with carefully written conditions. The trusts would fund scholarships, support community programs, and preserve the family business for future generations. Nash would continue receiving financial security and benefits, but no husband or wife could ever claim ownership of the fortune through marriage alone. Every safeguard was written clearly to prevent outside influence or manipulation. Once the documents were finalized, each signature was witnessed according to the law, notarized, and securely stored in multiple protected locations. Only my attorneys and I knew the changes had been completed. I didn't tell Nash because I wanted him to understand the truth about his marriage before learning about my decision. I certainly didn't tell Brielle because she had already shown exactly why these protections were necessary. As I left the law office that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since this ordeal began, I had peace of mind, knowing my legacy was finally protected. A few days after I finalized my new estate plan, Brielle's confidence grew stronger than ever. She seemed convinced that everything was falling into place exactly as she had imagined. During a family brunch attended by several relatives, the conversation drifted toward long-term planning and retirement. Without any hesitation, Brielle smiled and suggested that it might be the perfect time for me to update my will so everything would be organized for the family's future. The room became noticeably quiet. Before anyone could respond, she continued talking as though the outcome had already been decided. She spoke about preserving the family's wealth for future generations and casually referred to my estate as something that would eventually belong to our household. A few relatives exchanged uneasy glances, clearly surprised by how comfortable she seemed discussing money that wasn't hers. Nash looked embarrassed but remained silent, unsure how to interrupt without creating a scene. I listened carefully without showing any emotion. Rather than arguing or correcting her in front of everyone, I simply smiled and thanked her for sharing her thoughts. Then I calmly announced that I had been considering important financial decisions myself and would hold a formal family meeting the following weekend so everyone could hear my plans together. Brielle's eyes immediately lit up with excitement. She thanked me enthusiastically and squeezed Nash's hand beneath the table, convinced she had finally persuaded me to do exactly what she wanted. She left that gathering believing my announcement meant I was ready to hand over control of my fortune. What she didn't know was that every document had already been completed, every decision had already been made, and the meeting I had planned would reveal a future she never saw coming. The following weekend, everyone arrived at my home expecting a simple conversation about my estate. My attorneys were already seated in the living room with neatly organized folders, and several close relatives joined us out of curiosity. Nash looked nervous but hopeful, while Brielle walked in with complete confidence. She was dressed as though she were attending an important business meeting instead of a family gathering. She greeted everyone warmly, took a seat beside Nash, and smiled at me as if she had already won. I welcomed everyone, thanked them for coming, and explained that I wanted to remove any confusion about my future plans. I told them I believed families deserved honesty when discussing important matters, which was why I had invited my attorney to present everything clearly. Without any dramatic introduction, I nodded to him, and he opened the first folder. As he began reading the legal documents, the atmosphere changed almost immediately. He explained that my estate had already been reorganized under a new legal structure and that every decision had been finalized days earlier. My investments, properties, business interests, and financial assets had all been placed into protected trusts with carefully written conditions. No one interrupted him, but the silence in the room became almost overwhelming. I watched Brielle's confident expression slowly disappear as each paragraph erased another assumption she had been carrying for months. She glanced toward Nash, expecting him to object, but he remained speechless, trying to understand what he was hearing. Every expectation Brielle had built around my fortune was quietly falling apart, one legal document at a time, and there was nothing anyone could do to change what had already been signed. My attorney continued reading without interruption, explaining every detail with calm precision. He stated that my $53 million estate would no longer pass through a traditional inheritance. Instead, nearly every major asset had already been transferred into legally protected trusts that could not be altered by outside pressure or future marriages. The trusts would provide scholarships for hardworking students who couldn't afford college, fund housing programs for military veterans, support children's hospitals, and preserve the Hale family legacy under carefully written conditions. Each provision reflected the values I had spent my life believing in. My attorney then explained that Nash had not been disinherited. He would always have financial security, but he would never receive unrestricted control over the estate. Any benefits available to him would remain protected and could never become marital property simply because he was married. If he chose to build his own success, the trusts would support him responsibly, but no spouse would ever gain ownership of what I had built through decades of sacrifice. As those words settled into the room, Brielle's expression changed completely. The confidence she had carried into the meeting disappeared, replaced by disbelief. She stared at the documents as though expecting someone to correct a mistake. When no one spoke, she quietly asked whether there was another version of the will. My attorney calmly answered that these legally executed documents were the only valid estate plan. The room remained silent. Several relatives lowered their eyes, finally understanding why I had remained so patient for months. Brielle had spent all that time believing my fortune would become hers through marriage. In a matter of minutes, that belief vanished, leaving her with nothing she had expected to claim. The silence lasted only a few seconds before Brielle stood up and challenged my attorney. She insisted there had to be another version of my estate plan and accused him of confusing everyone with legal language. Her voice grew louder as she argued that families should trust one another instead of hiding important financial decisions. My attorney remained calm and simply repeated that every document had been legally prepared, signed, and finalized before the meeting. There was nothing left to debate. I looked over at Nash and saw something I hadn't seen in months. For the first time, he wasn't defending his wife. He sat quietly, replaying countless conversations in his mind. He remembered every question Brielle had asked about my investments, every discussion about retirement, every comment about handing over control, and every time she encouraged him to convince me to step aside. The pieces finally fit together. He slowly turned toward Brielle and asked about the draft documents I had discovered in the study weeks earlier. Her face immediately changed. She tried to dismiss them as harmless planning and claimed she had only wanted to help organize the family's future. When Nash continued asking questions, she stopped answering directly. Instead, she blamed me for being secretive and accused everyone else of twisting her intentions. The excuses only made the truth more obvious. Nash lowered his head, deeply disappointed. He realized that the woman he had trusted had spent months focusing on an inheritance instead of building genuine relationships with the family. Watching his expression break hurt my heart, but I also knew he had finally seen the truth for himself. No one had forced him to believe it. The evidence had spoken on its own. The weeks after the family meeting were quiet, but the damage could no longer be repaired. Nash and Brielle argued constantly, and the trust that had once held their marriage together slowly disappeared. He questioned everything she had said over the past year, while she continued insisting that everyone had misunderstood her intentions. Instead of accepting responsibility, she blamed me, my attorneys, and even Nash for refusing to support her. Eventually, they separated, and within a few months, the marriage officially ended. Brielle tried to negotiate a financial settlement based on the wealth she believed should have become part of her future, but every attempt failed. My estate was protected exactly as my attorneys had planned, and there was no legal path for her to claim any portion of the fortune. She left the Hale family with nothing she had expected to receive. I didn't feel happy watching someone else's life fall apart. Revenge had never been my goal. What brought me peace was knowing that the business I had spent decades building would serve a meaningful purpose instead of becoming a reward for greed. The scholarships, veterans housing programs, children's hospitals, and family trusts would continue helping people long after I was gone. That was the legacy I wanted to leave behind. Nash came to see me often after the divorce. One afternoon, he apologized with tears in his eyes for ignoring the warning signs and allowing someone else's influence to come between us. I hugged my son without hesitation. We couldn't erase the past, but we could learn from it. Little by little, we rebuilt the trust we had nearly lost, proving that family could still heal when honesty finally replaced deception. Several months later, I stood outside a new community center that had been built with support from one of my charitable trusts. Children's laughter filled the air as families gathered around a colorful playground, and volunteers welcomed local veterans into programs designed to help them rebuild their lives. Watching those moments reminded me why I had worked so hard all those years. Money had never been the real reward. It was simply a tool that could create opportunities long after I was gone. Looking around, I realized I hadn't lost anything by protecting my estate. If anything, I had finally ensured that my life's work would continue serving a purpose far greater than personal wealth. Brielle had entered our family believing that $53 million was the key to the future she wanted. She thought security could be inherited and happiness could be guaranteed through someone else's success. In chasing an inheritance, she overlooked the value of trust, respect, and genuine relationships. When everything was over, she walked away with nothing because she had measured people by what they owned instead of who they were. Nash stood beside me that afternoon, smiling as children played nearby. Our relationship had grown stronger through honesty, forgiveness, and difficult lessons neither of us would ever forget. He had rebuilt my trust by proving that character mattered more than convenience, and I couldn't have been prouder of the man he was becoming. As we prepared to leave, I took one last look at the families enjoying the place my fortune had helped create. That was the inheritance I truly wanted to leave behind, not wealth that divided people, but a legacy that brought hope, opportunity, and kindness to generations who would never even know my name.